The most dangerous mistake is not believing a lie. It is believing you already know the truth before the evidence has a chance to speak. At exactly 8:17 on a clear Monday morning, thousands of travelers moved through Terminal C of Chicago O'Hare International Airport with the quiet urgency that always filled one of the busiest transportation hubs in America. Business executives hurried toward early departures with coffee in one hand and rolling luggage in the other. Families gathered around digital departure boards while children pointed excitedly toward aircraft waiting beyond the massive glass windows. Flight attendants crossed polished floors with practiced confidence. Airport announcements echoed through the terminal every few minutes, and security officers guided endless lines of passengers toward their assigned gates. It looked like another completely ordinary day until one woman reached Gate 12. Officer Danielle Brooks, a black female police officer from Chicago, walked calmly through the concourse wearing a neatly pressed navy travel suit instead of her department uniform. A small leather carry-on rolled quietly behind her, while an official government credential rested securely inside her handbag. She carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions under pressure. Nothing about her appearance suggested urgency. Nothing about her expression invited conflict. She simply approached the boarding checkpoint, handed over her identification, and waited politely for the routine verification that normally lasted less than a minute. The airline employee scanned her documents once, paused, then quietly scanned them again. A slight crease appeared across the employee's forehead before she looked toward another workstation. Without saying much, she asked Danielle to remain where she was for a moment. Danielle nodded with a calm smile and stepped slightly to one side so other passengers could continue moving through the boarding lane. Within 2 minutes, another employee arrived. Then another. They spoke softly while looking back and forth between the computer screen and Danielle's identification. Travelers began slowing their pace as curiosity quietly replaced routine. Some assumed there had been a technical problem. Others wondered whether an important traveler required additional screening. Danielle remained completely still, folding her hands comfortably in front of her while patiently waiting for someone to explain the delay. A few minutes later, Airport Operations Supervisor Michael Turner walked confidently toward Gate 12 wearing a dark business jacket with an official airport identification badge clipped neatly to his lapel. Years of managing complicated situations had taught him to trust procedure above instinct. He greeted the employees, reviewed the information displayed on the terminal, then looked directly at Danielle with a professional but cautious expression. "Ma'am, I am afraid we cannot allow you to proceed just yet," he said evenly. "There appears to be an issue that requires additional verification." Danielle met his eyes without showing frustration. "I understand," she answered calmly. "Please take whatever time your procedures require." Michael seemed slightly surprised by the response. Most delayed travelers immediately demanded explanations or questioned the decision. Danielle did neither. Instead, she quietly moved another step away from the boarding lane to avoid slowing the growing line behind her. Every few moments, another passenger glanced toward Gate 12 before continuing forward. Airport surveillance cameras mounted above the ceiling silently recorded every movement, while nearby travelers unknowingly captured short videos on their phones, believing they were simply witnessing another unusual airport delay. Danielle never asked anyone to stop recording because she had learned long ago that facts rarely become weaker when people observe them honestly. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became nearly 30. Boarding for the scheduled flight continued while Danielle remained standing exactly where Michael had requested. The gate area slowly transformed into an audience without anyone realizing the ordinary morning had quietly become the beginning of a story that none of them would fully understand until much later. 30 minutes slowly stretched toward 40 as the steady rhythm of Gate 12 began changing in subtle ways that only patient observers could notice. Travelers who had originally hurried toward their flights now found themselves glancing back over their shoulders. Some quietly wondered why the composed black woman near the boarding lane had remained standing in exactly the same place for so long without raising her voice or demanding answers. Others assumed there must have been a complicated security issue because Airport Operations Supervisor Michael Turner had not left the gate area since arriving. Michael reviewed the information on his secure terminal once again. Every procedure he had followed throughout his career taught him that unusual alerts deserved careful attention. The system displayed an authorization conflict that did not match the identification Danielle Brooks had presented only minutes earlier. Her government credential appeared genuine. Her driver's license matched perfectly. Her travel itinerary had been properly issued. Yet one encrypted notification prevented the boarding process from moving forward. Michael had seen technical errors before, but this message felt different. It provided almost no explanation while instructing airport personnel to suspend access pending additional verification. Years of experience told him that ignoring such a notice could create serious consequences. Danielle remained quietly beside the seating area, her carry-on suitcase resting upright beside her. She never checked her watch. She never sighed impatiently. Instead, she calmly observed the ordinary life of the terminal unfolding around her. Children laughed while watching airplanes through the enormous windows. Business travelers answered conference calls with wireless headsets. Airport employees continued directing passengers toward nearby gates with practiced efficiency. The world kept moving while she simply waited. Michael finally approached her again with measured professionalism. "Officer Brooks, I appreciate your patience," he said. "Unfortunately, I still cannot authorize boarding until I receive clarification." Danielle offered a polite nod. "I understand your responsibility," she replied. "Please continue following your procedures." Her answer surprised him once more. He had expected frustration long before now. Instead, every response reflected remarkable composure. One airline employee quietly whispered to another that Danielle had not complained a single time. Another employee admitted that most travelers would have demanded a supervisor within the first 5 minutes. Danielle had done exactly the opposite. She had allowed every step to unfold naturally. As more passengers gathered near the gate, quiet speculation spread through the waiting area. Some believed an important government investigation might be taking place. Others assumed there had been an identification mistake that would soon be corrected. Several travelers discreetly recorded short videos with their phones, capturing only a woman standing peacefully beside her luggage while airport staff continued speaking with supervisors. None of those recordings showed anger because there was none. None showed disorder because the atmosphere remained calm. Above them, the security cameras silently preserved every conversation, every movement, and every passing minute with perfect consistency. Michael contacted the Airport Operations Center for another update. The response remained exactly the same. "Wait. Do not proceed. Request no further explanation through standard channels." He frowned slightly. Those instructions were unlike anything he normally received. Returning to Gate 12, he found Danielle exactly where he had left her, calmly watching aircraft taxi across the runway beyond the glass. "This may take a little longer," he admitted. Danielle answered with quiet confidence. "Then we will let the process take the time it needs." Michael studied her expression for a brief moment. There was no fear, no irritation, no attempt to persuade him to change his mind. Only the calm certainty of someone who seemed completely comfortable allowing the truth to arrive on its own schedule. Without realizing it, everyone at Gate 12 had begun waiting for the same answer, even though none of them yet understood that the ordinary delay before them was only the beginning of a story whose most important chapter had not even entered the terminal. By the time the departure board displayed a final boarding notice for the scheduled flight, more than 45 minutes had passed since Danielle Brooks first presented her identification at Gate 12. The aircraft remained connected to the jet bridge while airline personnel quietly coordinated with airport operations, trying to understand why an ordinary passenger verification had become an unusually sensitive matter. Around the gate, conversations grew softer rather than louder. Travelers sensed that something important was unfolding, even though no one could explain exactly what it was. Danielle remained exactly where she had been asked to wait, standing comfortably beside her small carry-on suitcase with remarkable composure. She occasionally glanced through the wide, terminal windows toward the aircraft parked outside, but her expression never revealed frustration or concern. Airport Operations Supervisor Michael Turner watched her carefully from several feet away. During his career, he had encountered travelers who became impatient within minutes, business executives who demanded exceptions, and government officials who expected immediate accommodation. Danielle displayed none of those behaviors. Instead, she appeared completely willing to let the process continue exactly as required. That unusual confidence slowly became the detail Michael found most difficult to understand. Another operations specialist arrived carrying a secure tablet connected directly to the airport's internal authorization network. Together, they reviewed Danielle's credentials for a third time. Every visible document matched perfectly. Her travel reservation had been issued correctly. Her government identification passed every authentication check available to the airport. Yet the same encrypted notice continued appearing across the secure system. Authorization suspended. Await additional verification. Do not override. Michael quietly asked whether the operations center had provided additional instructions. The specialist slowly shook his head. Nothing has changed, he answered. They told us not to clear her through the gate until further notice. Michael frowned thoughtfully. Did they explain why? No, the specialist replied. Only that standard communication channels cannot resolve this alert. Those words echoed in Michael's mind. Standard communication channels. That phrase rarely appeared unless another federal authority controlled the verification process. Still, nothing about Danielle suggested she posed any threat. If anything, she appeared unusually patient for someone experiencing such an unexpected delay. Michael approached her once again. Officer Brooks, I realize this situation has become inconvenient, he said sincerely. If there is anyone you would like us to contact on your behalf, we can certainly help. Danielle offered a small appreciative smile before reaching into her handbag. She removed a mobile phone, looked briefly at the screen, then quietly dialed a single number from memory. She waited only a few seconds before someone answered. This is Danielle Brooks, she said calmly. I have arrived at Gate 12. The verification process is still pending. She paused and listened carefully. Understood. I will remain exactly where I am. Another brief silence followed before she answered with only 3 more words. Thank you, sir. She ended the call, returned the phone to her handbag, and resumed waiting as though nothing unusual had happened. Michael expected her to explain who she had contacted. She offered no explanation. He considered asking, but decided against it. Whatever conversation had just taken place seemed to increase Danielle's confidence rather than her concern. Nearby passengers noticed the brief phone call as well, and quiet speculation immediately spread across the gate area. Some assumed she had contacted an attorney. Others believed she had spoken with a senior police official. A few wondered whether federal authorities were somehow involved, although none of them had any evidence beyond simple curiosity. Above the terminal, surveillance cameras continued recording every ordinary second with silent precision, while airport announcements echoed through the concourse announcing departures to cities across the country. The terminal remained peaceful, the passengers remained patient, and Danielle remained exactly where she had promised to stay. What nobody at Gate 12 realized was that somewhere beyond the airport, 3 quiet sentences spoken during a phone call had already set an entirely different chain of events in motion. Nearly 2 hours had passed since Danielle Brooks first arrived at Gate 12, yet the atmosphere inside the terminal remained surprisingly calm. The scheduled flight had departed without her. Another aircraft had already begun boarding at a neighboring gate, and the steady rhythm of the airport continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Travelers came and went. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors. Electronic announcements filled the concourse, and sunlight streamed through the enormous windows overlooking rows of aircraft preparing for departure. Only the people near Gate 12 understood that time itself seemed to be moving differently there. Airport Operations Supervisor Michael Turner remained committed to following every established procedure. He had spoken with airline operations, airport administration, and the Central Authorization Center more times than he could count, yet every response remained unchanged. Continue holding the passenger. Await authorized verification. Do not bypass the security notice. The lack of additional information troubled him more with every passing minute. Danielle, however, showed no sign of frustration. She occasionally thanked airline employees who offered her bottled water, politely declined special seating when someone suggested she should be more comfortable, and continued waiting with the same composed confidence she had displayed since arriving. Several employees quietly commented that they had never seen anyone remain so calm during such a lengthy delay. Michael eventually walked over once again. Officer Brooks, he said respectfully, I know this has required extraordinary patience. I wish I had more information to share. Danielle smiled gently. I believe you are doing exactly what your responsibilities require. Michael hesitated before asking the question that had occupied his thoughts for the last hour. May I ask whether you know what is causing this? Danielle paused briefly before answering. I believe I know why the system cannot resolve this through normal channels. Michael waited for her to continue. Instead, she simply added, the appropriate people have already been notified. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to intimidate anyone. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who trusted a process larger than the one unfolding inside the terminal. Michael nodded slowly, uncertain what to make of that answer. Moments later, one of the airline employees looked toward the far end of the concourse. Two individuals wearing dark professional suits had just entered the terminal through a secured access corridor normally reserved for authorized personnel. They walked at an unhurried pace with small identification wallets clipped discreetly beneath their jackets. Neither carried visible luggage. Neither appeared rushed. Yet something about their calm confidence immediately drew quiet attention from airport employees who recognized that they had entered through an area unavailable to the public. As they approached Gate 12, conversations gradually faded. Michael instinctively stepped forward, preparing to introduce himself. Before he could speak, one of the two visitors displayed an official federal credential just long enough for airport security personnel to recognize its authority. Good morning, the senior agent said politely. We are here regarding Officer Danielle Brooks. Michael immediately glanced toward Danielle, expecting concern or surprise. Instead, she simply acknowledged the two visitors with a calm nod, as though she had anticipated their arrival all along. The second federal agent smiled respectfully before addressing her first. Officer Brooks, thank you for your patience. Those simple words instantly changed the atmosphere surrounding Gate 12. The agents did not ask Danielle for identification. They did not question her credentials. They did not request additional verification. They spoke to her with immediate professional recognition. Michael felt a quiet realization settle over him. Whatever mystery had occupied Gate 12 for nearly 2 hours had never centered on Danielle's identity. It had centered on a verification process controlled somewhere far beyond the airport itself. Around them, travelers who had quietly observed the delay looked on with growing curiosity, while the surveillance cameras above continued recording every moment with perfect neutrality, silently preserving the instant when the story everyone thought they understood began changing completely. The arrival of the two federal agents changed nothing about the volume inside the terminal. Yet somehow, every conversation near Gate 12 became noticeably quieter. Travelers who had been casually watching from a distance instinctively paused. Airline employees stopped whispering among themselves. Even airport operations supervisor Michael Turner found himself studying the calm expressions of the two visitors rather than the identification wallets they had already returned beneath their suit jackets. Neither federal agent displayed urgency. Neither attempted to take control of the area. Their confidence came from something much quieter than authority. It came from certainty. The senior agent turned toward Michael with a courteous smile. Supervisor Turner, thank you for following established procedures, he said. We understand this situation has created an unusual delay. Michael nodded respectfully. We have been attempting to verify Officer Brooks through every authorized channel available to us. The second agent answered without criticism. That is exactly what you were expected to do. Those words immediately eased some of the tension Michael had carried for nearly 2 hours. For the first time since the unusual alert appeared, someone had confirmed that his decisions had been appropriate rather than excessive. Danielle Brooks remained quietly beside her carry-on luggage while the agents approached her. The senior agent extended his hand. Officer Brooks, thank you for your patience. Danielle returned the handshake with the same composed professionalism she had shown throughout the morning. I appreciate your coming, she replied. I assumed the notification would eventually reach the correct office. The second agent smiled slightly. It did. Michael listened carefully, trying to understand what had unfolded without making assumptions. May I ask whether Officer Brooks has now been fully verified? He asked. The senior agent nodded. Yes. Her credentials have never been in question. Michael looked briefly toward the operations terminal before returning his attention to the agents. Then may I ask why the authorization remained suspended for so long? The agent answered thoughtfully. because the verification required secure federal coordination that could not be completed through the airport's standard systems. The alert was designed to prevent anyone from making an incomplete decision before the appropriate review had finished. Michael absorbed the explanation slowly. Everything that had seemed confusing suddenly became logical. The airport system had not identified Danielle as a problem. It had simply recognized that her travel authorization belonged to a different level of review than the airport itself could complete. The second federal agent requested temporary access to a nearby administrative office rather than discussing confidential details in the public terminal. Michael immediately escorted both agents and Danielle into a quiet operations room overlooking the concourse through large glass windows. Inside, secure credentials were presented, encrypted documentation was reviewed, and protected verification records were briefly displayed only to personnel with the appropriate authorization. Every document confirmed the same conclusion. Danielle had arrived with completely legitimate credentials, valid government authorization, and approved travel documentation from the very beginning. The only delay had been caused by a verification process intentionally designed to remain outside ordinary airport communication channels. When the review concluded, the senior agent closed the secure folder and thanked Michael once again. "Your responsibility was never to guess," he said calmly. "Your responsibility was to wait until the facts became complete. That is exactly what you did." Michael quietly exhaled, realizing that nearly 2 hours of uncertainty had ended, with a lesson rather than a mistake. As they stepped back into the terminal, the ordinary sounds of the airport returned almost immediately. Boarding announcements echoed across the concourse. Passengers continued toward distant gates, and sunlight reflected across polished floors exactly as before. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the morning unfold, Gate 12 no longer felt like the place where someone had been delayed. It had quietly become the place where patience had allowed the truth to arrive before anyone rushed to the wrong conclusion. The following morning, life inside Terminal C looked exactly as it always had. Yet the people who had witnessed the events at Gate 12 understood that something important had quietly changed. Airport Operations Supervisor Michael Turner arrived earlier than usual, carrying a notebook filled with observations from the previous day. Rather than viewing the incident as an inconvenience, he now saw it as an opportunity to strengthen procedures that already existed. Before the first wave of departing passengers reached the security checkpoints, he gathered airline supervisors, gate personnel, and airport operations staff for a brief meeting inside the conference room overlooking the concourse. Danielle Brooks and the 2 federal agents had already continued their respective assignments without requesting recognition, publicity, or special treatment. Their departure left behind something far more valuable than explanations. It left behind perspective. Michael stood before his colleagues and spoke with complete honesty. "Yesterday reminded us that following procedure and rushing to conclusions are not the same thing," he said. "Our responsibility is to protect both security and fairness at the same time. Neither one can exist without the other." Around the room, employees nodded thoughtfully because many of them had personally observed Danielle's patience throughout the long delay. One airline representative admitted that she had quietly assumed Danielle would eventually become frustrated. Another employee confessed that the unusual alert had caused everyone to imagine possibilities before they possessed complete information. Michael wrote one sentence across the whiteboard for everyone to read. "Verification must always come before interpretation." Nobody disagreed. Later that afternoon, airport leadership requested a formal review of the entire timeline surrounding the Gate 12 verification process. Surveillance recordings, communication logs, authorization requests, and system notifications were examined minute by minute. The review revealed something both simple and powerful. Every employee involved had followed established procedures correctly. The delay had never been caused by carelessness or misconduct. Instead, the confusion had grown because incomplete information naturally invited unnecessary assumptions among those observing from the outside. The review committee agreed that future training should emphasize communication during unusual situations so travelers understood that waiting for facts was sometimes the safest and most responsible decision. Several weeks later, those recommendations became part of a new employee training program used throughout the airport. Gate supervisors practiced responding to uncommon verification alerts with calm professionalism while emphasizing respectful communication with every traveler regardless of appearance, occupation, or circumstance. Michael often used the Gate 12 incident as an example without identifying Danielle by name or discussing confidential federal details. The goal is never to guess correctly, he would remind new employees. The goal is to make decisions supported by complete evidence. Months passed, and Gate 12 quietly earned a reputation among frequent travelers for professionalism, courtesy, and consistency. Employees took extra care to explain procedures clearly, answer questions respectfully, and allow every verification process to reach its proper conclusion before forming opinions. Danielle occasionally traveled through the airport again during official assignments. Each time she moved through the terminal with the same calm confidence that had defined her from the beginning. She never mentioned the delay. Michael occasionally noticed her crossing the concourse, and the two exchanged nothing more than a respectful nod before continuing with their responsibilities. No words were necessary because the lesson had already been learned. Above the boarding area, the same security cameras continued recording thousands of ordinary moments every single day. They never celebrated victories, never repeated rumors, and never favored one story over another. They simply preserved the facts exactly as they happened, waiting patiently until someone was willing to see the complete picture. Because real authority is never proven by the speed of a decision. It is proven by the wisdom to wait until the truth has finally arrived. Almost 6 months after the unusual morning at Gate 12, the story had quietly faded from public conversation, yet its influence continued reaching people who had never witnessed the delay themselves. New airport employees learned a revised training program built around one central principle. Every unusual situation deserved complete verification before anyone attached meaning to what they observed. Airport operations supervisor Michael Turner noticed the difference almost immediately. Employees asked more thoughtful questions, communicated more clearly with travelers, and showed greater confidence whenever unexpected system alerts appeared. They had discovered that professionalism was measured not by how quickly a problem disappeared, but by how carefully the truth was protected while the answer was still unknown. Danielle Brooks never returned seeking recognition for what had happened. She simply continued serving her community with the same quiet discipline that had defined her career long before anyone at the airport knew her name. One autumn afternoon, she received an invitation to participate in a regional seminar attended by airport security leaders, transportation officials, and law enforcement supervisors from across the Midwest. The organizers wanted to discuss cooperation between agencies during situations involving restricted federal verification. Danielle accepted only after making one request. She asked that no individual be criticized during the presentation because she believed the greatest lessons came from improving systems rather than assigning blame. Inside the conference center, dozens of experienced professionals filled the auditorium, while presentation screens displayed timelines, communication procedures, and examples of coordinated decision-making. Danielle stood before the audience wearing a simple navy business suit instead of her police uniform. She spoke calmly, never raising her voice, never dramatizing the events that had unfolded months earlier. She described how patience had protected everyone involved from making decisions based upon incomplete information. She explained that every person at Gate 12 had fulfilled a responsibility, even when they did not yet understand the entire picture. One airport director raised a thoughtful question. How did you remain so calm while waiting for nearly 2 hours without knowing when the verification would end? Danielle smiled gently before answering. Because I trusted that good procedures exist for difficult days, not ordinary ones. If I expected others to respect the process, I needed to respect it first. The room became remarkably quiet. Several attendees immediately wrote those words into their notebooks. Another participant asked whether she ever considered demanding special treatment once she realized the verification required federal coordination. Danielle slowly shook her head. Professionalism loses its value the moment it depends on privilege instead of principle. Those words lingered throughout the remainder of the seminar. After the presentation concluded, Michael Turner, who had been invited as one of the transportation representatives, approached Danielle during a brief break. They greeted each other warmly before walking toward a window overlooking the city skyline. I have wanted to thank you for something, Michael admitted. Danielle looked at him with quiet curiosity. For your patience? She asked with a small smile. Michael laughed softly. For allowing us to learn without making us feel defeated. Danielle nodded thoughtfully. People improve when they are trusted with the truth, not embarrassed by it. Before returning to the conference hall, they exchanged a respectful handshake that reflected mutual appreciation, rather than obligation. Months earlier they had met because of uncertainty. Now they stood together because of understanding. Somewhere beyond the conference center, airports across the country continued moving millions of travelers every week, each carrying a different destination, a different purpose, and a different story. Yet every journey still depended upon one timeless principle. The strongest decisions are rarely the fastest ones. They are the decisions made only after every available fact has finally been given the opportunity to speak. Nearly 1 year after the quiet morning that had changed so many professional perspectives, the lessons from Gate 12 continued spreading far beyond Chicago. Transportation organizations, airport management teams, and public safety agencies increasingly emphasized one principle that had become impossible to ignore. Facts deserve the opportunity to arrive before opinions became permanent. Danielle Brooks rarely thought about how many people had heard the story because she had never viewed it as a personal achievement. To her, it remained a simple example of what happened when patience met professionalism. One crisp winter morning, she received another official travel assignment requiring her to pass through Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The trip itself was routine, and unlike the previous journey, there were no confidential verification delays waiting ahead. She parked her vehicle, entered the familiar terminal, and walked toward the security checkpoint with the same quiet confidence she carried every day. Around her, thousands of travelers hurried between ticket counters, restaurants, departure boards, and boarding gates. Holiday decorations filled the concourse with warm light, while families reunited, business travelers reviewed presentations, and children watched aircraft through the enormous terminal windows. It felt like every other busy travel day, yet something subtle had changed beneath the surface. Employees greeted passengers with greater patience than before. Questions were answered more carefully. Unusual situations received calm explanations instead of hurried responses. Danielle noticed the difference immediately, although she never mentioned it aloud. As she approached the security checkpoint, one of the supervisors recognized her. Instead of making a public announcement or treating her differently from anyone else, the supervisor simply smiled and welcomed her with professional courtesy. Danielle appreciated that gesture more than any formal recognition could have offered because equality meant being treated fairly, not exceptionally. While waiting for her belongings to pass through the screening equipment, she observed a young airport employee helping an elderly traveler whose identification required additional verification. The employee spoke respectfully, explained every step of the process, answered each question patiently, and reassured the traveler that waiting did not mean something was wrong. Danielle quietly watched the interaction without interrupting. She realized that the greatest proof of lasting change was not found in policies or training manuals. It appeared in ordinary moments when people chose dignity over assumptions. After clearing security, Danielle continued toward her departure gate. As she passed Gate 12, she slowed for only a brief moment. The gate looked completely ordinary. New passengers waited calmly beside the windows. Airline employees scanned boarding passes with practiced efficiency, and aircraft arrived and departed according to schedule. There was nothing dramatic left to see, yet the place carried a quiet significance that only a few people fully understood. Michael Turner happened to be walking through the concourse conducting his routine operational inspection when he noticed Danielle near the gate. Their eyes met, and both smiled naturally before Michael approached. "Good morning, Officer Brooks," he said warmly. "Good morning, Supervisor Turner," Danielle replied. Michael looked around the busy terminal before speaking again. "Sometimes I stand here and remember how uncertain everything felt that day." Danielle glanced toward the boarding lane where another group of travelers prepared to leave. "Uncertainty is not the problem," she answered thoughtfully. "What matters is how we treat people while we are waiting for certainty to arrive." Michael reflected on those words for a moment before quietly nodding. They wished each other safe travels and returned to their responsibilities without another sentence. As Danielle continued walking toward her flight, the same surveillance cameras remained mounted above the terminal, recording every ordinary conversation with perfect consistency. They still favored no one. They still judged no one. They simply preserved the truth exactly as it unfolded, reminding everyone willing to notice that fairness is rarely created by extraordinary moments alone. More often, it is built one respectful decision at a time. As the seasons continued changing, the quiet lessons born inside one airport terminal began influencing conversations far beyond transportation. Professional organizations invited experienced leaders to discuss trust, verification, and responsible decision-making, often using anonymous case studies that reflected situations remarkably similar to what had happened at Gate 12. Danielle Brooks never sought to become the face of those discussions, yet her example continued shaping them because it demonstrated something increasingly rare in a fast-moving world. Patience had protected both fairness and security without forcing either to compromise. One spring afternoon, Danielle attended a joint leadership workshop hosted by several public safety agencies and transportation authorities from across the region. Rather than delivering a formal keynote address, she participated in a roundtable discussion where experienced professionals openly examined difficult situations requiring careful judgment. The conversation quickly turned toward the growing pressure to make immediate decisions while surrounded by public attention, mobile phones, and social media. One airport executive admitted that employees often felt judged within seconds, long before complete information became available. Another law enforcement supervisor observed that people sometimes confused speed with competence, even when waiting produced better outcomes. Danielle listened quietly until someone finally asked how she personally viewed those moments of uncertainty. She folded her hands thoughtfully before answering. "Every investigation begins with questions," she said. "Problems begin when we start answering those questions before the evidence has finished speaking." The room fell silent for several seconds. Many participants recognized the simplicity of the statement while also understanding how difficult it could be to practice during real situations. Michael Turner, who had also been invited to the workshop, shared his own perspective from the airport side of the experience. "That morning taught me something I never learned from policy manuals," he explained. "Following procedure protects people. Respectful communication protects trust. We need both if we expect the public to have confidence in our decisions." Several transportation managers nodded in agreement while making notes beside their printed agendas. Later that afternoon, the workshop divided into smaller discussion groups where participants reviewed realistic scenarios involving unusual security alerts, confidential federal coordination, and unexpected delays affecting travelers. Danielle deliberately avoided telling anyone exactly what had happened to her. Instead, she encouraged every group to ask one simple question before making any decision. What information do we still need? That question gradually became the focus of every discussion. Instead of debating conclusions, participants concentrated on identifying missing facts, verifying evidence, and improving communication. By the end of the workshop, many agreed that changing one question often changed the entire outcome. As everyone prepared to leave, a young transportation supervisor approached Danielle with quiet appreciation. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Today reminded me that professionalism is not about proving I am right. It is about making sure the decision is right." Danielle smiled warmly before answering. "When we protect the process protects everyone." Those words remained with the young supervisor long after the conference ended. Months later, she introduced that same principle during orientation sessions for newly hired employees at her own airport. Meanwhile, daily life at Chicago O'Hare continued with its familiar rhythm of departures, arrivals, reunions, and new beginnings. Millions of passengers passed beneath the same security cameras each year without ever knowing that one ordinary morning had quietly influenced countless future decisions. The cameras never recorded lessons or opinions. They simply preserved moments exactly as they occurred. It was the people who chose whether those moments became forgotten memories or lasting wisdom. And for those willing to learn, the greatest truth remained beautifully simple. Fairness is never weakened by patience. It becomes stronger every time someone allows the complete story to be seen before deciding how it should be remembered. More than a year had passed since the unusual verification at Gate 12, yet its influence continued reaching places Danielle Brooks never expected. The event itself had long disappeared from daily conversation, replaced by ordinary airport routines, new travelers, and countless departures that looked no different from any other day. What remained was not the memory of a delay. It was the quiet habit of choosing evidence before assumption. Danielle returned to her normal responsibilities with the Chicago Police Department, where professionalism was measured not by recognition but by consistency. Every shift brought different calls, different people, and different decisions requiring patience under pressure. Colleagues often admired her calm approach during complicated situations, although very few knew about the experience that had strengthened those qualities even further. She never told the story unless someone could genuinely benefit from its lesson. One afternoon, Danielle was invited to speak with a class of newly promoted supervisors attending an advanced leadership development program. The discussion focused on decision-making during situations where incomplete information created pressure for immediate action. Rather than beginning with theories or regulations, Danielle asked everyone in the room a simple question. How many times have you believed you understood a situation before discovering one important fact that changed everything? Nearly every hand rose. Some participants smiled quietly, remembering moments from their own careers. Others exchanged knowing glances with coworkers who had experienced similar situations. Danielle nodded before continuing. Experience teaches us many valuable skills, she said. But experience can also create confidence that arrives before the evidence does. That is why discipline matters more than certainty. The room remained completely silent as those words settled into everyone's thoughts. She then described an anonymous situation involving a traveler delayed during a secure verification process without identifying herself, the airport, or any of the individuals involved. Instead of emphasizing the unusual circumstances, she focused on the behavior that allowed everyone involved to reach the correct outcome. Respectful communication, patient observation, trust in established procedures, willingness to wait until every necessary fact became available. When she finished, one supervisor raised an important question. If you already believed you were right, how did you avoid becoming frustrated? Danielle answered without hesitation. Because proving I was right was never the objective. Reaching the right decision was. Several participants immediately wrote down the sentence. Another asked whether public perception had made the experience more difficult. Danielle smiled gently. Public attention often arrives before complete information. That is why our responsibility is to remain steady until the truth catches up. The discussion continued for nearly another hour, with participants sharing examples from their own careers where patience had prevented unnecessary mistakes. By the end of the session, the instructor thanked Danielle not for telling an extraordinary story, but for reminding experienced professionals that the strongest leadership often appeared during ordinary moments requiring quiet restraint. As she left the building later that afternoon, Danielle looked across the city skyline while the sun slowly settled toward the horizon. She thought briefly about the countless people she had encountered throughout her career, many of whom would never remember her name. That never mattered. What mattered was whether every interaction left people with greater confidence in fairness, integrity, and professionalism. Somewhere across Chicago, aircraft continued departing from busy terminals while passengers hurried toward new destinations. Security cameras quietly recorded another ordinary day, preserving facts without emotion, without assumption, and without preference. They simply waited for someone willing to understand the entire picture before deciding what it truly meant. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Wisdom is not measured by how quickly we reach an answer. It is measured by our willingness to keep listening until the truth has finally finished speaking. Several months after the leadership program concluded, Danielle Brooks found herself reflecting less on the events at Gate 12 and more on the people whose lives had quietly intersected because of them. She had never believed that one ordinary morning inside an airport terminal would influence training programs, professional workshops, or conversations about responsible leadership across multiple agencies. Yet the greatest changes often arrived without headlines. They appeared in everyday decisions made by people who remembered a lesson when nobody else was watching. One bright Monday morning, Danielle received a handwritten letter delivered through her department's administrative office. Handwritten letters had become uncommon, making the envelope stand out among routine paperwork and official notices. She opened it carefully and discovered a thoughtful message from a young airport employee named Emily Carter, someone she did not immediately recognize. Emily explained that she had been hired at Chicago O'Hare International Airport only a few months after the Gate 12 incident and had completed the updated employee training that now emphasized respectful communication, patient verification, and professional judgment. During one particularly difficult shift, an elderly traveler became anxious after an unexpected identification review delayed his departure. Other passengers grew impatient, and the atmosphere around the gate became increasingly uncomfortable. Emily admitted that she had briefly considered rushing the process simply to reduce tension. Then she remembered something her instructor had repeated during training. Respect every person while waiting for every fact. Instead of hurrying, she calmly explained each step to the traveler, answered every question, and reassured him that additional verification did not mean he had done anything wrong. A few minutes later, the issue was resolved through routine procedures, and the grateful traveler thanked her for treating him with dignity during an uncertain moment. Emily ended her letter with one simple sentence. "I never met you that day, but your patience helped me protect someone else's peace of mind." Danielle quietly folded the letter and smiled. She realized that influence rarely traveled in straight lines. One person's calm response often became another person's example years later without either of them ever realizing how closely their lives had become connected. Later that week, Danielle placed the letter inside a folder where she kept reminders of why public service mattered. It contained no awards, no certificates, and no newspaper articles. Instead, it held small notes of appreciation from ordinary people whose lives had briefly crossed her path throughout her career. To Danielle, those quiet expressions of trust carried greater meaning than public recognition ever could. Across town, Michael Turner continued leading airport operations with the same thoughtful approach he had developed after the Gate 12 experience. New supervisors often noticed that he never interrupted employees while they explained unusual situations. Instead, he listened completely before asking questions. When asked about his leadership style, he often answered with the same advice. The facts are never offended if you take time to find them. His team gradually adopted the same habit, creating an environment where careful thinking became part of the airport's culture rather than merely another written policy. Neither Danielle nor Michael viewed themselves as remarkable people. They simply believed that fairness deserved patience and that professionalism required humility. Together, without planning it, they had helped demonstrate that real trust is not created by dramatic speeches or perfect circumstances. It is built quietly through ordinary moments when people choose respect over assumption and truth over convenience. Long after names are forgotten and memories begin to fade, those choices continue traveling through the lives of people we may never meet, proving that the strongest legacy is often invisible, carried forward one thoughtful decision at a time. 2 years after the quiet morning that had unexpectedly connected so many lives, the story no longer belonged to a single airport, a single traveler, or a single supervisor. It had become something larger, carried quietly through conversations, training sessions, and daily decisions made by people who understood that trust is built one moment at a time. Danielle Brooks never measured success by how many people remembered her name. She measured it by whether those around her felt respected after every interaction, especially during moments of uncertainty. One early summer afternoon, she accepted an invitation to visit a youth leadership program sponsored by local law enforcement agencies and community organizations across Chicago. The audience was filled with high school and college students considering careers in public service, aviation, emergency management, and criminal justice. Rather than standing behind a podium, Danielle pulled up a simple chair and sat at the same level as the students. She wanted the conversation to feel personal instead of formal. For nearly an hour, she answered questions about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of earning public trust through everyday actions rather than impressive titles. Near the end of the discussion, a young student raised his hand and asked a question that caused the room to become completely quiet. "Have you ever been misunderstood while you were simply trying to do your job?" Danielle paused for several seconds before smiling gently. "Yes," she answered honestly. "More than once." The student leaned forward with curiosity. "What did you do?" Danielle looked around the room before responding. "I reminded myself that another person's first impression is not always their final understanding. If I lose my patience before the truth arrives, then I become part of the confusion instead of part of the solution." Several students immediately wrote down her words. Others simply listened without looking away. Danielle continued by explaining that real leadership begins long before anyone notices it. It begins with the decision to remain respectful when respect feels difficult, to remain honest when shortcuts seem easier, and to remain patient when immediate answers are impossible. She never mentioned Gate 12 by name. She never described federal agents or secure verification systems. She simply shared the lesson itself because she understood that principles last longer than individual stories. After the program ended, one young woman waited until the room had nearly emptied before approaching Danielle. She explained that she wanted to become an airport security officer because she believed every traveler deserved to feel both safe and respected. Danielle smiled warmly before offering one final piece of advice. Never forget that every person standing in front of you has a story you cannot see. Your responsibility is not to imagine that story. Your responsibility is to treat them with dignity until the facts reveal what you truly need to know. The young woman thanked her sincerely before leaving with renewed confidence about her future. As Danielle stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, she realized that the most meaningful victories rarely happened during dramatic moments. They happened quietly, when one conversation encouraged another person to make better decisions years later. Across the city, Michael Turner continued mentoring new supervisors with the same thoughtful discipline that had become his trademark. Emily Carter trained new airport employees using the same principles that had once guided her through an anxious traveler's difficult morning. None of them were repeating a famous story. They were simply passing forward a way of thinking that placed truth ahead of assumption and dignity ahead of convenience. In the end, that quiet legacy proved stronger than any single event because genuine justice does not end when one misunderstanding is resolved. It continues every time another person chooses patience long enough for the truth to be seen. Years passed, and the morning at Gate 12 slowly became one of those stories that no longer belonged to the people who had lived it. It belonged to the values it had quietly protected. Travelers continued filling the terminals before sunrise. Children still pressed their hands against the tall windows to watch departing aircraft. Business professionals hurried toward connecting flights, and airport employees welcomed thousands of strangers every day with the understanding that each person carried a destination, a responsibility, and a life beyond what anyone could immediately see. Danielle Brooks continued serving her community with the same quiet integrity that had defined her long before that unexpected delay. She never sought recognition, never corrected people who misunderstood her accomplishments, and never measured her worth by titles or attention. She understood that real authority did not become stronger when announced. It became stronger when exercised with humility. Michael Turner eventually accepted a senior leadership position overseeing operational standards across several transportation facilities. Whenever young supervisors asked him what experience had shaped his leadership the most, he never mentioned technology, management theories, or emergency planning. Instead, he simply answered, "One ordinary morning reminded me that our first responsibility is not to prove we are right. It is to make sure we are fair." Those words became part of countless conversations with future leaders who carried the lesson into airports, public agencies, and organizations across the country. Emily Carter grew into one of the airport's most respected training coordinators. During every orientation session, she reminded new employees that procedures protected security, but respect protected public trust. She encouraged them to remember that travelers often experienced airports during important moments of their lives. Some were beginning new careers. Others were returning home after military service, visiting family members, attending graduations, welcoming new children, or saying goodbye to loved ones. No employee could possibly know every story walking through the terminal, which made treating everyone with dignity even more important. One quiet evening, long after the final departures had slowed, Danielle happened to pass through Chicago O'Hare International Airport once again. Her assignment had ended, and she was simply another traveler making her way home. As she walked through the familiar concourse, she paused for only a moment near Gate 12. Nothing about the gate appeared extraordinary. Airline employees smiled as they greeted passengers. Boarding announcements echoed softly through the terminal. Families gathered their luggage while children laughed beside the windows overlooking the runway. It looked exactly as an airport should look when people trusted the system around them. Danielle smiled gently before continuing toward her flight without saying a word. She did not need a memorial, a plaque, or public recognition because the greatest evidence that something meaningful had happened could already be seen in the ordinary kindness surrounding her. Somewhere above the boarding area, the same security cameras continued their silent work, recording each conversation without prejudice, each decision without opinion, and each moment without assumption. They captured only facts, leaving people to decide what those facts truly meant. Perhaps that had always been the quiet difference between judgment and justice. Judgment often arrived before the complete story. Justice waited patiently until every voice had been heard. As another aircraft lifted into the evening sky above Chicago, carrying hundreds of passengers toward different futures, one simple truth remained behind for everyone willing to remember it. A badge may represent authority. A uniform may represent responsibility. A title may represent achievement. But character is revealed only when no one knows the whole story, and someone still chooses fairness over assumption, patience over pride, and truth over appearance. Because in the end, the strongest measure of any person is not the power they carry into a room. It is the dignity they leave behind after they quietly walk away.